He still came back to my bed, same side of the mattress, same routine at night. I didn't question it at first. I thought it meant something. But then I noticed what didn't come back with him. The conversations, the openness, the need to talk. He touched me. He stayed. He slept next to me. But when things got heavy, when life overwhelmed him, I wasn't the one he turned to anymore. That's when it hit me. He hadn't left the relationship. He had just stopped coming back to me. I'm a woman in a long-term relationship that, from the outside, still looks intact. We live together. We share routines. We share a bed. I wasn't looking for problems. I wasn't suspecting cheating. I wasn't searching for attention somewhere else. But slowly, I realized something had shifted. He kept returning physically, but emotionally, he stayed distant. I became the place he rested, not the person he opened up to. This is the story of realizing that physical presence doesn't always mean emotional return, and the moment I had to question what I was really accepting. Do you think someone can still be in a relationship while emotionally checking out? Subscribe and share this story if you believe emotional presence matters as much as physical presence. At the beginning, I told myself I was overthinking. He was still there, still coming home, still sharing the same space with me. I thought emotional distance was just stress, work, pressure, life getting heavier. I didn't want to be that person who turns everything into a problem. So I adjusted. When he was quiet, I stayed quiet too. When he avoided deep conversations, I followed his lead. I told myself this was what understanding looked like. But understanding slowly turned into silence. I noticed that when something bothered him, he didn't bring it to me anymore. He handled it on his own. Or at least, he didn't handle it with me. I would ask simple questions. How was your day? Are you okay? He always answered, but never expanded. Short replies, neutral tone, no opening. At night, his body still reached for me. Familiar, automatic. That confused me more than distance ever could. Because how could someone still want closeness but avoid connection? I started feeling like I was there to provide comfort, not companionship. A place to rest, not a person to share with. And the worst part was that I allowed it. I didn't demand clarity. I didn't push for answers. I didn't want to risk hearing something I wasn't ready for. So I stayed quiet. I convinced myself that as long as he kept coming back to the bed, the relationship was still alive. Looking back, that was the first compromise I made with myself. Not a big one, just small enough to ignore, but small compromises have a way of stacking up, and I didn't realize yet that this was only the beginning. Do you think staying quiet to avoid conflict helps a relationship, or slowly weakens it? After a while, it stopped feeling temporary. At first, I waited. I told myself he just needed time. Everyone goes through phases. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing shifted back. I noticed how he dealt with stress differently now. He didn't talk things through anymore. He didn't unload his thoughts at the end of the day. He just handled it somewhere else, or with someone else. I didn't know which was worse. I started paying attention to patterns. When something clearly upset him, he became quieter around me. But later, he seemed lighter, calmer, like the weight had already been processed, just not with me. That realization stayed in my head longer than I wanted to admit, because if I wasn't the person he leaned on anymore, what role did I still have? I didn't feel jealous. Not at first. I felt confused. I replayed old versions of us in my mind, how he used to sit next to me and talk until things made sense, how he needed my reactions, my reassurance. Now, he didn't seem to need any of that, and that hurt in a quiet way. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him of pulling away. I was scared that naming it would make it permanent. So instead, I adapted more. I lowered my expectations. I told myself that intimacy didn't always look the same forever, that this was just maturity. But deep down, I knew the difference between growth and withdrawal. Growth feels shared. Withdrawal feels lonely. And I was starting to feel alone, even when he was right next to me. At night, when his body reached for mine, I stopped feeling reassured. I felt conflicted, because I didn't know if that closeness meant he still chose me, or if it was just habit. And once that question enters your mind, it doesn't leave easily. If someone stops sharing their inner world with you, do you think it's something that can come back? Or is it usually a sign of permanent change? That's when I started questioning myself, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. I wondered if I had changed, if I had become less interesting, less comforting, less necessary. I replayed conversations in my head, trying to find the moment where I might have failed him emotionally. Did I listen enough? Did I ask the right questions? Did I make him feel safe? The fact that I was asking those questions already said a lot, because somewhere along the way, I had started taking responsibility for his emotional distance. I noticed how careful I became around him. I didn't want to overwhelm him. I didn't want to demand too much. I didn't want to be another problem. So I minimized myself. I shared less about my day. I kept my worries to myself. I didn't want to add weight to someone who was already carrying things elsewhere. That hurt more than I expected, because relationships aren't supposed to feel like a burden calculation. I began to feel like emotional closeness had become a privilege I hadn't earned anymore. And yet, at night, he still came back to my bed. That contradiction messed with my head. How could someone still want your body but not your thoughts? Your presence but not your depth? I started noticing how this affected my confidence. I questioned my attractiveness, even though he still touched me. I questioned my value, even though I was still there. I questioned my place, even though nothing had officially changed. That uncertainty was exhausting, because I wasn't rejected clearly. I wasn't abandoned openly. I was slowly faded out emotionally, and that kind of loss is harder to grieve. There were moments when I wanted to shake him and ask, "Do you still choose me?" But I didn't, because I was afraid the answer wouldn't match the comfort of staying, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear that. So I stayed silent again. But this time, silence didn't feel like patience. It felt like self-doubt taking root. When someone pulls away emotionally, do you think it's natural to blame yourself, or should that be a warning sign? That's when temptation appeared. Not in the way people usually imagine. There was no flirting, no touching, no intention to cross a line. It started with conversation. Someone listened. Someone asked questions and waited for the answers. Someone noticed when I paused before finishing a sentence. And I felt it immediately. Relief. Not excitement. Not attraction. Relief at being emotionally seen again. That scared me, because I wasn't looking for that kind of attention. I wasn't searching for validation. I wasn't unhappy enough to justify it. But when emotional space opens where there was none, you notice it. I caught myself thinking about how easy it felt to talk, how natural it was to be understood without explaining myself twice, how light I felt afterward. And then the guilt followed. I told myself this was dangerous, that I shouldn't enjoy it, that emotional closeness belongs inside a relationship. But then another thought appeared. What if my relationship had already stopped being that place? I didn't act on anything. I didn't hide messages. I didn't create secrets. But mentally, something shifted. I realized how starved I had been for emotional exchange, how much I had normalized being unheard. That realization didn't make me want to cheat. It made me question why being emotionally present with someone else felt like a threat, instead of something I already had at home. I felt torn. Loyalty told me to pull back immediately. Honesty told me to acknowledge what this meant. Because temptation isn't always about desire. Sometimes it's about remembering what it feels like to matter. And that's a harder line to draw. I went home that night and looked at him differently, not with anger, with clarity. I wasn't tempted by someone else. I was tempted by the version of myself that felt emotionally alive, and that forced me to ask a question I had been avoiding. Was I betraying him by noticing this? Or was I betraying myself by pretending I didn't need it? Do you think emotional temptation counts as crossing a line? Or does it reveal something that was already broken? The guilt didn't come from what I did. It came from what I felt. I hadn't crossed any lines. I hadn't hidden anything. I hadn't lied. And yet, I felt uneasy, because once you realize how empty you've been feeling, you can't unknow it. I tried to shut it down. I told myself to focus on my relationship, to be more patient, to stop comparing. I convinced myself that every long-term relationship goes through quiet phases, that emotional closeness comes and goes, that I was expecting too much. So I tried harder at home. I asked him about his day again. I listened without interrupting. I stayed open. But the response didn't change. He answered politely, briefly, safely. No doors opened. That's when the internal conflict became impossible to ignore. On one side, loyalty told me to stay silent, to protect the relationship, to not create problems that didn't technically exist. On the other side, honesty whispered that something fundamental was missing. I felt guilty for wanting more. Guilty for noticing how good it felt to be emotionally understood. Guilty for comparing. But then another thought followed. If wanting emotional presence makes you feel guilty, what does that say about the relationship you're in? I realized I was spending more energy suppressing my needs than actually having them met. That's exhausting. I wasn't choosing someone else. I was choosing between ignoring myself or facing a truth that scared me. And that's when I understood something important. This wasn't about temptation anymore. It was about whether I was willing to keep living with emotional hunger just to avoid disruption. That question stayed with me longer than the guilt did, and I knew I wouldn't be able to avoid answering it forever. At this point, would you prioritize loyalty to the relationship or honesty with yourself? I didn't plan a confrontation. There was no speech prepared, no dramatic timing. It happened on an ordinary night. We were sitting together, doing separate things, sharing space but not presence, that familiar silence that had become normal. And suddenly, I felt tired. Not angry, not emotional, just tired of carrying everything alone. I asked him a simple question. Do you feel close to me? He didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than words ever could. He looked at me, like someone choosing the safest response. I don't know, he finally said. That hurt, but it was honest. I didn't accuse him. I didn't bring up anyone else. I didn't list all the moments I felt shut out. I just told him how it felt on my side, how he still came back to the bed, but not to me, how his body was present, but his thoughts weren't shared anymore. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deny it. But he also didn't open up. He explained that he didn't mean to pull away, that he didn't even realize how closed he had become, and I believed him. But belief didn't fix the problem. Because awareness without effort doesn't rebuild connection. The conversation ended quietly. No resolution. No promise to change. No clear next step. Just an acknowledgement that something was missing. After that night, nothing exploded. But something shifted. The silence between us wasn't unspoken anymore. It was recognized. And that made it heavier. Because once a problem is named, ignoring it becomes a choice. And I knew that the next choice wouldn't be his alone. It would be mine. If someone acknowledges emotional distance but doesn't try to change it, do you think that's honesty or avoidance? After that conversation, I stopped waiting for clarity from him. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because I realized clarity wasn't coming. Days passed, and nothing really changed. We were polite, functional, too calm. He didn't withdraw further, but he didn't step closer either. And that middle space started to feel unbearable. I noticed how careful I became with my expectations. I stopped hoping he would suddenly open up. Stopped imagining a moment where everything would click back into place. I had learned not to expect emotional availability from him anymore. That realization didn't break me. It steadied me. I began paying attention to my own emotional state instead of monitoring his. I asked myself questions I had avoided for months. How long had I been compromising my needs? How much of myself had I minimized to keep things peaceful? When did I start accepting less just to avoid being alone? Those questions didn't come with easy answers, but they came with honesty. I realized that staying had become a strategy, not a desire, a way to delay discomfort, a way to avoid making a decision. And that scared me, because I didn't want my life to be shaped by avoidance. There were moments when he reached for me at night, and I felt the familiar closeness. But now, instead of comfort, I felt distance. Not physical distance, emotional distance. I understood then that the problem wasn't whether he still wanted me. It was whether I could continue wanting a relationship where emotional intimacy felt optional. I started imagining what leaving would actually mean. Not the logistics, not the explanations, but the emotional aftermath, the quiet, the uncertainty, the space I would have to sit with. And surprisingly, That image didn't feel terrifying. It felt honest. I wasn't planning to leave yet. I wasn't packing bags. But I was emotionally preparing myself for a truth I couldn't ignore anymore. If nothing changed, staying would slowly teach me to accept a version of love that felt incomplete. And I wasn't sure I could do that without losing myself. That's when I knew I was closer to a decision than I wanted to admit. Do you think staying in emotional limbo is harder than making a clear decision? Even if that decision hurts, letting go didn't look like leaving. It looked like pulling myself back. I stopped centering my emotional state around him. Stopped checking his mood before checking my own. Stopped adjusting myself to fit the version of him that stayed closed. That was harder than I expected, because for a long time, my sense of stability came from proximity, from knowing he was there, from sharing space, routines, habits. But proximity had stopped being the same as connection. I started noticing how much emotional labor I had been doing without realizing it, how often I filled silence, how often I softened my needs so the relationship could stay comfortable. When I stopped doing that, the relationship didn't collapse. It just stayed exactly where it was. That told me everything. I spent more time alone, not physically, but mentally. I let my thoughts exist without filtering them through what he might feel. I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't automatically include him. That felt disloyal at first, but then it felt necessary. I realized I had been loyal to the relationship in ways that required me to be disloyal to myself. That imbalance had slowly reshaped me. I noticed how much calmer I felt when I wasn't waiting for him to show up emotionally, how much lighter my days felt when I didn't measure them against his availability. That scared me too. Because relief can feel like betrayal when you've been holding on for too long. He noticed something was different. Not enough to ask the right questions, but enough to sense that I wasn't reaching for him the same way. He didn't push. He didn't pull closer. He stayed where he was. And that confirmed what I had already accepted. I wasn't pulling away from him. I was pulling myself back from a situation that required me to shrink. And once you stop shrinking, it becomes impossible to pretend the space feels comfortable. I knew then that the ending wouldn't come from a fight. It would come from clarity, and clarity doesn't rush. It waits until you're strong enough to act on it. Do you think emotionally letting go before leaving is a form of self-protection? Or does it make the ending harder? The final realization didn't come with anger. It came with silence that felt different. Not heavy, not tense, resolved. I noticed how I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, no longer waited for the right moment to say something meaningful, no longer hoped he would suddenly notice what I was carrying. That hope had quietly expired. One evening, we sat together like we always did. Same space, same routine, and yet, it felt unfamiliar. He talked about his day in general terms. I listened. I nodded. But there was no urge to go deeper. Not because I didn't care, but because I had accepted that depth wasn't something he was willing to offer anymore. I realized I had stopped fighting for emotional access, not out of exhaustion alone, but out of understanding. You can't force someone to open a door they've chosen to keep closed. And more importantly, you shouldn't have to beg for emotional presence in a relationship. That thought stayed with me. I paid attention to how calm I felt, how steady. The anxiety that once lived in my chest had softened, not because things were better, but because I had stopped resisting what was true. I understood then that silence had become a decision, not his, mine. By staying quiet, I was no longer waiting for him to change. I was preparing myself to change my situation. And that's when I knew the ending was inevitable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just honest. I wasn't angry enough to fight. I wasn't desperate enough to beg. I was clear enough to walk away. The hardest part wasn't letting go of him. It was letting go of the version of us I had kept alive on my own. And once I accepted that I had been carrying that future alone, the present made sense. Silence wasn't the problem anymore. It was the answer. When silence starts to feel like clarity instead of confusion, do you think the relationship is already over? I didn't leave in the middle of an argument. I left after a normal day. Nothing went wrong. Nothing exploded. And that's what made it clear. I realized I was no longer staying because I believed in us. I was staying because leaving felt inconvenient, because it would disrupt routines, because it would force explanations, because it would make things uncomfortable. But staying had already cost me something much bigger, my emotional presence. I told him calmly that I didn't feel chosen anymore, that sharing a bed without sharing a life had started to feel empty, that I needed more than familiarity. He listened. He didn't fight it. That hurt. But it also confirmed everything, because when someone doesn't try to stop you from leaving emotionally, it means they already let go in their own way. I didn't accuse him. I didn't blame him. I just acknowledged the truth, that he still came back to my bed, but he never fully came back to me. And I couldn't keep accepting that version of love without losing myself. Walking away wasn't easy. It wasn't brave. It was necessary. I chose discomfort over slow disappearance. I chose uncertainty over emotional neglect. And for the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with myself again. Not because I won, not because I was right, but because I stopped asking someone to open a door they had already decided to keep closed. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.